John Mann, thank you for joining me today. I'm so excited to welcome you to talk with me about your newest release, Conquering the North. And yeah, welcome to ACMS, as it were, to our virtual series here, to our virtual interviews. So I'm very excited to have you here today. John Mann, for those of you watching, you are a historian specializing in Mongolia and the relationship between Mongol and Chinese cultures. Uh, You've studied Mongolian as a postgraduate and had a brief career in journalism and publishing before you turned to writing. You've had a really prolific writing career spanning decades, and your books have been published in over 20 languages around the world and include best-selling biographies of Chinggis Khan, Kublai Khan, and Attila the Hun. So, as well as histories of the Great Wall of China and the Mongol Empire. Your 2009 book, Xanadu, Marco Polo and Europe's Discovery of the East, was acquired by HarperCollins US, who retitled the book Marco Polo to accompany the 10-part Netflix original TV series Marco Polo, which I did not know. I think that's amazing. So congratulations. That's crazy. So now your latest release, Conquering the North, China, Russia, Mongolia, 2,000 Years of Conflict, was just published in the US on December 2nd by Pegasus Books here and is available at bookstores nationwide. So, John, thank you so much for joining me today for this interview.
It's my pleasure.
So, to get things started, is there anything else you'd like to kind of introduce about yourself, or maybe tell me a little bit more about your background?
You pretty much summarized it. Thanks very much. You mentioned decades, and indeed it has been decades since I was at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, doing Mongolian. That was as a postgraduate. I did languages at Oxford, German and French. So those are my first two languages, foreign languages, other than Mongolian.
Yeah, that's amazing. What a jump from French to Mongolian for sure.
Well, we were planning an absolutely ridiculous student idea to drive to Mongolia. And it was a scientific expedition to collect blood samples. That was the idea anyway. And the deal was that I could go along if I learned the language, which is why I booked myself into SOAS and did a postgraduate. The expedition, naturally enough, never happened. So I was left with this unfulfilled ambition. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, I was able to go there and started a new career.
What a transition. Can I ask blood samples of what or for
Oh,
what purposes?
human. But the one thing they were really good at, of course, was veterinary science. So they had no need of students coming from Oxford to help them collect blood. It was a lunatic idea.
That's yeah, that's not where I was expecting that to go, or I suppose what an interesting start. I always like to hear how people kind of start their Mongolian studies or Mongolia, connections for those of us who are not from Mongolia,
Well,
and
the
have as
connection
far
goes
as
back a bit further,
sure.
a little further back than that in ways, because I was teaching English in Vienna as part of my undergraduate studies, and was intrigued by the wall, no, the not the Great Wall, but the Soviet Wall, which was quite close to Vienna, both Czechoslovakia and Hungary, and used to drive out and look at this barbed wire monstrosity and wonder what was behind it. And of course, the Soviet Empire went all the way across to Mongolia. Not that Mongolia was still nominally independent, but nevertheless, it was part of Comecon, and I was intrigued by that immense distance. And when I got back to Oxford, there was a sign on the notice board saying anyone interested in expedition. So naturally, I leapt aboard, and that's how it all started.
That's so what a sort of fascinating way to um, get there. And yeah, that's such an interesting parallel. I mean, you spend a lot of time in your book talking about the Great Wall and sort of its precursors as well, and thinking about, the different kinds of walls and borders that have been set up over time to either, in some ways keep people out and also to keep people in, depending on where you are in relation to that wall.
Absolutely, yes. Well known in Mongolia because they call it the White Wall, the Tsagan Kerim, because it was originally painted with lime, and it must have been shining white in its original manifestation.
what a sight to behold as you're riding, kind of across, and then you come upon this sort of this huge shining white wall would be much
Yeah.
more maybe impactful than what we think of, which is, oh, everything was just kind of whatever earthen tone it is now. But of course,
Well,
that's
it
not
is.
usually
Have you
not
ever
the case.
seen? Have you ever been down there? Have you seen it?
I
Seen
haven't
the?
yet. No.
Yeah, it's not so great anymore, but it's still there.
Yes, there's a lot, yeah, to think about with those words, for sure. And so, that's kind of a change. And I was wondering, as you've been, so your first visit was after the transition to
After the
democracy.
revolution. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And I had the idea of, I thought everybody would know all about Genghis, so I wouldn't write about Genghis. And spent a summer in the Gobi Desert and did a book on my travels there, sort of combination of anthropology and whatever else I could find. And that, having done that, I realized that I completely missed the whole point about Mongolia, which is Genghis himself. So, and that was why I suggested it to my publishers. And then one thing led to another, and now there are quite a few books out there on the Mongol Empire.
Yeah, I really appreciated this book specifically because you cover so much more. You don't really actually touch on the sort of Chinggisid period much at all. You really are looking at a more expansive view of that. And so, in this kind of huge topic that has so many interesting periods, and fascinating events and characters involved in it. I guess first, what made you decide to take on this very immense challenge of writing this book, that covers such a long period, over 2,000 years of history? And if I was wondering if there were any specific moments or experiences that gave rise to this work for you.
Well, I suppose it started from the present and worked backwards. And I was pretty appalled at what's happening between China and Mongolia now. And I thought, I wondered how far back I could take this whole relationship. And of course, it goes back to the very beginning of China and the Xiongnu. And I didn't see any way of avoiding the whole subject. But of course, I couldn't cover the whole subject. It's too enormous. So it is, I have to warn my readers, it's fairly selective and it's based largely on my own experiences. So I knew about the Xiongnu. I'd written about the first emperor, and I took it forward from there through the Xianbei, who uh, uh, were one of the many successor empires to the Xiongnu and sort of bridged the gap between the Xiongnu and the Mongolians. And that's a fairly natural relationship because the Mongolians look back to the Xiongnu as their forefathers, even now. And it's probably as a result of the Xiongnu Chinese wars that that modern Mongolians have a little bit of Xiongnu DNA in them and look back to them as ancestors.
Yeah, that makes sense. It does seem like a logical place to start, and kind of hearing it conceptualized like that. Yeah, I think it felt like a really compelling place to start, and then kind of going through all of these centuries of history, the relationship between Mongolia and China and these different groups, who go back so much farther than our concepts of Mongolia and China as, nation states that we know now. Can you tell me a little bit about your process of how you chose, of course, out of all of this, kind of where and when to focus both your research and then later as you're crafting your narrative? I assume you did much more research than what you were able to include in this very readable account. So how did you kind of narrow down what you wanted to look at,
Well,
sort of throughout the book?
I was pretty intrigued by the relationship between China and Mongolia, and the fact I suppose one of the starting points was I was in a museum in Inner Mongolia. Where was it? I can't remember the name of the museum, but the guide who was showing me around said that they knew all about the Mongols, because the Inner Mongolia which meant Mongolia, as far as he was concerned, was actually Chinese. And he said, "We're very proud of Genghis Khan because he was the only Chinese who conquered Europeans." And I thought, this is absolutely eccentric. I mean, does he not know any history at all? Who conquered who, and when, and what the relationship was exactly, and why the Chinese should think the Mongolians were actually Chinese, and the fact that Mongolia that Kublai Khan conquered all China for Mongolia, and who ruled who in the long run, and that was really the starting point of it, and the whole relationship is something I wanted to get under my belt and write about.
It's a really interesting, I don't know, there's a lot that can be and has been and should be explored about, historical feelings of ownership, or, is it, what is the word, brotherhood, or is it, there's a difference, right, depending on who you
Yes.
talk to, between what that relationship is. So I'm wondering, did you that brings up an interesting question. You talked to a lot of Chinese folks, and then, but you did also travel to Mongolia, and you have traveled to Mongolia before.
Yeah.
So in thinking about that kind of sentiment, I am curious if you ever found that this sort of feeling of, well, actually, this other country should be part of us, or was, or, claim historical claiming or ownership of regions or people. Do you find that when you were speaking to people in Mongolia, that kind of ever went
Oh
the
no,
other
the
way
Mongols
as well?
obviously, yeah, the Mongolians obviously extremely rejectionist, as it were, of the whole Chinese imperialism, which ended in 1912, and the Chinese, on the other hand, feel that Mongolia is really part of China. It's just fallen away a little bit in recent years because, after all, it was all part of the Yuan Empire, which they regard as Chinese, despite the fact that it was actually Mongolian. And then, of course, that segued into the Manchus, and that was also a foreign dynasty, but that is regarded as Chinese by the Chinese. And so that whole question intrigued me, and I wanted to tell the whole story, which is what you have in front of you.
And yeah, it's really intriguing, and certainly, again, goes back to topics that I, have explored a little bit in my own, research when I was, a student, and I'm still really interested in, is just this kind of historical claims of, who is claiming which groups or which eras or which figures, and for what purposes are they claiming them? Because the idea of neutrality is sort of a myth, in this kind of, or objective claiming, well, what's your reason? At least that's my, personal opinions. So, and something I did notice, is that, it seems like a lot of the narrative and, your own travels and research, you really have a sort of what seems to be a deliberate geographic and thematic focus on Inner Mongolia. And, of course, you just talked a little bit about some of the reason why that is, but what kind of made you decide to base that, sort of what seems at least like the bulk of your research and writing there, versus, either connecting more with Mongolia, or going to Mongolia and seeing their, like what was your kind of thought process behind that? If that does that question make sense? I'm not sure.
Well,
So.
I mean, it started with Mongolia and Genghis Khan, but you can't deal with that subject without also dealing with China, with the Jin, which was the empire in Manchuria at the time, and his relationship there. So there's a natural affinity with Chinese subjects, and you can't also deal with the Chinggis without looking at his consequences. And one of his consequences was his grandson Kublai, who set up his northern capital in Shangdu, in Xanadu, which is now so thoroughly part of China. And so I went to Xanadu, as we call it, Shangdu, and saw it. It's a wonderful archaeological site, and if you've got a chance to go there, you should, because it's now got a nice little museum where there's been quite a lot of archaeology there, and yet it's in China, and of course Kublai himself. Um, Moved on from he built Xanadu because he realized he couldn't govern from Karakoram. He needed a base which was relatively near China, which he because of the Chinggisid ideology of world conquest, China was going to be on his list for conquest in the very near future, so that he wouldn't be able to do that without having a semi-Chinese base, which was Xanadu. And as soon as he got there, of course, he realized that that was only halfway, and what he really needed to be was in Beijing, which had been destroyed by his grandfather, and which he himself, therefore, started to rebuild. There are ironies in this whole story which intrigue me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very, yeah, definitely. Yes, lots to untangle there, I guess so one could say. And certainly makes sense, this kind of, and I don't know, something that I was really interested to read about in this book, because it's something I've looked at a little bit. It wasn't ever the focus of my graduate studies, but is the way that different groups claim Chinggis as, a figure for political or religious or,
Yeah,
economic purposes. I mean, I think that the idea, if you're in Mongolia, and everything is Chinggis branded and or Han
yeah,
branded,
yeah,
and it's like I love that. I think it's such an interesting sort of, you know, anthropological case study of and I think in the States we totally do that too in different ways with some of our, big historical figures. And so I think that's, but then the way that China does it is different but similar and for different purposes. And so, looking at those interplays, but it's also so much bigger than Chinggis. And I think, again, that's one of the things I really appreciated about this book was that, you don't start and end with Chinggis Khan or the Chinggisid dynasty, Chinggisid period at all, which really was not a very long time. It wasn't a huge, it was a very impactful part of world history and of Mongolian history, of course, but it certainly really wasn't, it was not centuries and centuries, And so,
it certainly wasn't. No, I mean,
yeah,
Yuan was just 100 years
yeah,
from foundation to end. And the interesting thing about Chinggis is, I mean, the Chinese regard him as Chinese. You go to Kazakhstan and they say, oh, he's actually a Kazakh. Um, everybody claims a little bit of Genghis.
and is, I mean, look at, all the kind of jokes people make about, well, we all have a little DNA or whatever. And it's like, well, no, that's comes from a different kind of place and a different mindset, but, sort of not necessarily true. But it is really interesting the way
It
that
is true.
people,
It is true. 1 in 16 males across Eurasia.
yeah,
I mean, it's not a result of, well, it is a result of Genghis in a way because it's a result of the conquests. But
right.
I mean, it's his family gene
Yeah,
spread by conquest.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and and thinking about that, I come originally from a Russian studies background. That was how I got into Mongolia and Mongolian
Oh,
studies. And so, it's interesting to see the perceptions of, the Mongol yoke, as it were, in
yes,
Russia.
yes.
Is still something that's really discussed, and I noticed that it wasn't, top of anyone's mind, but it certainly was present. And I was really interested in the role, of Russia and of Russians, some of the Russian actors in this book, and in your research, which, you do kind of start with some of those early um, meetings, ill-fated or not, of different groups and of different Russian imperial groups, and the way that you discuss that. Yeah, was very interesting. And so I was wondering if you could kind of speak more to, as you were doing your research, the role that you found Russia and, Russia, Imperial Russia, especially, to play in this, given their relationship with, or, conquest of their eastward expansion into Siberia, and their treatment of some of the Mongol groups in Russia's, or in what is now Russia as well, in Siberia.
Yes, well, I've one of the most fascinating subjects, I knew nothing about it, was the relationship between China and Russia in the 17th century. At the time, Russia had been edging eastwards. I mean, all European countries wanted an empire, and Russia had nowhere to go but eastwards. And on the coattails of some really appalling imperialists and merchants who are basically there to make money for themselves, and eventually working their way eastwards, um, devastating the tribes along the way, and eventually reaching the Pacific. And what happened then was that the Chinese, the Manchus, um, had come from that part of the world and were therefore very close to what was happening in Siberia. And the Kangxi emperor in China realized that unless there was some sort of a relationship between China and Russia, there would be trouble, big trouble on the northern frontier. So that he suggested the idea of some sort of a treaty that would designate the frontier, and hence the very little known Treaty of Nerchinsk, which was between Russia and China. An enormous Chinese delegation and a rather small Russian one met in the town of Nerchinsk, and the Russians were rather overawed by the Chinese presence and signed away a good deal of Manchuria and a chunk of Siberia as well, so that China regards themselves to be owners not only of Mongolia, which was part of the Manchu Empire, but also the parts of what is now Russia. And what then happened was that when the Chinese were in a weak position in the 1920s, Russia, late 19th century, Russia seized it all back again, simply took it without hardly a shot being fired, which was one of the most extraordinary repossessions in history. And as a result, Russia it owns territory which the Chinese would naturally claim, since they claim everything in the Manchu Empire. And this whole story was intriguing, and I tell the story of the Treaty of Nerchinsk, and the role, astonishingly, of two priests who were advisors to the Kangxi emperor. They were Jesuit priests, and they were employed by Kangxi as go-betweens, really, between China and Russia, because his logic was that as Jesuits, as Christians, they would speak Latin, and there should be, since Russia was a European country, they should have Latin as well. And so the treaty was drafted actually in Latin and then translated into Manchu and Chinese and Russian, and quite extraordinary story, because those two priests really saved the day. The Chinese were extremely arrogant in their attitude towards the Russians, regarding them as total barbarians, and also warmongers. And so they were ready to fight on several occasions during the negotiations. And the priests really saved the day and said, no, if you allow that to happen, Kangxi will be extremely cross with you. And so don't do it. These are not barbarians. They're quite educated people. And so eventually they got the treaty written and drafted in Latin and the three other languages.
I really enjoyed that chapter because I didn't know much about that, but also just reading the excerpts of the memoirs of the two priests, and kind of you can just see them
Yes.
there saying,
Oh
"Don't
my
do it.
God.
No, don't do it." It's just
Yeah.
so it was so funny in this kind of well, and we went up on the hill, and they then the Russians realized they were there waiting to attack, and said, "Oh no, we need to be here for animals to graze. This is
Yes.
what are you
Yeah,
doing?"
I saw it instantly as a film script, and used it as a film script in my book. And I
Absolutely.
wish somebody would make a film of it, because it would be a terrific subject.
Absolutely. Yeah, and absolutely would have to be some sort of, this is not a drama. This needs to be some sort of, at least partial comedy. It's just, at least the way that that
Yes.
was kind of, written out was just incredibly entertaining and such a, this kind of, I think this period, I think about this a lot, and a little bit later as well with more great game period activities, the way that, these it was just such a different world, I think, than the world that we live in today. And maybe that's a really sort of silly or obvious thing to say, but it's just this kind of thinking about the way that this sort of negotiation happened, and the roles that people would play, and this sort of confusion, or oh well, we see that they have chairs, and so we need to make sure we build some benches so that we're all, we need to sit in chairs too. All of that was just
Yes,
really
that's right. Yeah.
so entertaining. And yeah, really, sort of spoke to those early relations, and the role of both, sort of Slavic Russians, but then I really wonder, as well, if there are records, or if you encountered records from any, of the local, if there were any like records or any like Buryat or other, you know, Russian or not non-Russian, Slavic, non-Slavic kind of, local Siberian groups that were involved in this kind of negotiation, or later negotiations as well.
Of course, there was a whole movement called Pan-Mongolism, which is now a crime in China. But at one point it involved the Buryats, Mongolia itself, and the Inner Mongolians, and a sort of resuscitation of Chinggis's empire in a minor way. But that, of course, didn't come to anything because the Mongols were always in an inferior position with regard to the other imperial states on either side of them. The vast size of Russia and China overwhelmed any idea that the Mongols would actually be able to hold together.
Yeah, it's a really interesting kind of thing, because I think, I don't know how familiar you are with sort of the post 2022, post Russian conscription, sort of influx
Yes,
of Buryat and other, Siberian, folks into Mongolia, and the way that that's kind of playing out there is really something that I would really like to learn more about, and engage with more, and just sort of academically even, because it is a very different kind of relationship than, say, you know, that I've seen maybe before, or that has existed. So yeah.
yes. Well, I read that there were quite a crowd of Buryats getting into Mongolia when the war in Ukraine started. Um, and from the other side, of course, there is the a flight of literati, of intellectuals from Inner Mongolia into Mongolia, and also the Chinese response, which is pretty fearsome. There's anecdotal evidence of the involvement of the Chinese authorities in cahoots with some people in Mongolia to come and seize them back again. And take them back into Inner Mongolia for trial. And the whole modern circumstances since 20 since the passing of the legislation in China has been pretty fearful.
Yeah, that is a sentiment that I encounter, quite a bit in conversations with people, and something I really noticed, during that time online, was just how much solidarity there was, with people I knew in Mongolia for the whole language issue, and just the amount of concern, and you know real solidarity with people in Inner Mongolia, and the Mongolian language, and so that was something that I
Yes.
was really, yeah, really interested in, at that time.
I don't know if you saw, did you get to the end where I was involved with a show called The Mongol Khan,
Yes.
which was a tremendous success in London. And but before it, they wanted to do a show in China, and the agreements were there, all there, and were then cancelled at the last minute with high drama because the legislation was just being passed, the anti-Mongol legislation, and here you have a show in Mongolian which didn't accord at all with the views of the Chinese authorities as dictated by Beijing, and they were expelled from Inner Mongolia, from the Ordos region, from actually very near Genghis's mausoleum, and had to go back to Ulaanbaatar before coming to London. It was extremely dramatic, and Chinese actually offered $2 million equivalent of in compensation out of the blue. So uh, they made good to some extent, but got very bad publicity out of it.
Absolutely. Yes, I did read that, and I knew about that show, and I think I was in Mongolia when it was there, and then I remember
Yeah.
seeing that it was in the UK, but I hadn't heard about the 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 drama in Inner Mongolia. So yeah, that was such an interesting. Parts of that also were, sort of maybe darkly humorous in the way that they played out because it was just so sort of almost
Well, it's
cartoonish. I don't know.
tragicomic
Yeah.
when you talk about it, but at the time, the Mongolian, the whole crew were extremely frightened.
Oh, I'm
They
sure.
they
Yeah.
feared arrest at any moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, that must have been such a stressful situation and,
Yeah,
really glad that things didn't turn out worse than that. Although of course that was not an ideal outcome, for sure. So, you know,
yeah.
um,
Well, they managed to get out of that situation and put it on in London to sell out. Actually, it was here, so it was quite something.
amazing.
And myself and my wife is a playwright, um, pretty well known one in the UK. And in fact, her name is Timberlake Wurtenbaker, and she's did a play called Our Country's Good, which is done all over the place. It was done in America quite a lot, and I had it translated into Mongolian, and it was on actually at the National Theatre, the one near the library, about 20 years ago. And so she was got on board. I was doing an English version of the text, and she advised on the the dramatic adaptation of it. So there were two of us aboard on that for the London production, and we were hoping it was going to go around the world as the Mongolians were, but it doesn't seem to be happening just at the moment.
Yeah, that's too bad because I remember, hearing about kind of how successful it was, and it's such an interesting case of, kind of the kind of cultural diplomacy of,
Soft
you know,
power.
yeah,
Exactly. It's huge. And you didn't see it when you were in UB.
I wasn't able to, no, unfortunately.
Okay. I think it'll keep on coming back. So if you've got a chance, you might be able to see it.
Yeah,
But I don't think you'll be seeing it in the States. At least the last I heard.
that's disappointing, but perhaps we can look towards the future of
Maybe,
that could
maybe.
happen. I hope so, because I think that could be, I think there would certainly be an audience for it here, but, I just don't know, you know,
Yeah.
at the moment. So, yeah, and then thinking about, sort of other groups that were, involved and portrayed in your book, and also, that are experiencing a certain amount of, maybe assimilation or acculturation. I was really interested to read chapter 12, the Evenki, Life, Death, and
The
Survival.
Oenki, yeah.
Yeah,
They're fascinating. I'd heard about them before because they they had been traditionally hunters and used guns. But of course, when the Chinese authorities took the guns away, it pretty much destroyed the culture. And they were left with a lot of drunks who were co-opted and given pensions to live in cities, which was totally against their culture. But I was intrigued by it because it is a culture on the change, and they're pretty self-assertive people, and so that they can cope with the change. And they were left with a well, they had a so-called matriarch who was at least 100 years old when I heard about her, and I was lucky enough to be able to see her. It turned out she wasn't quite that old, but she was a remarkable looking character, but so old that she couldn't really communicate. She only spoke Ewenki, no Chinese, but a little Japanese because she'd been educated by the Japanese, and I thought, oh, wow, she's what a terrible experience. And so asked her through her daughter, who was doing the interpreting, what was the Japanese school like? And she said it was great, which was you're always shocked and surprised by things when you actually go to the places.
Absolutely.
That's what I like to do. Go to the places and you discover something new.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I really was wondering, what was your process like for like making contacts in that community and researching there? And, what kind of challenges did you face in trying to do that?
Well, they're all part of China now, and they're trying to encourage tourism, and also there's a lot of cultural of protection going on of the forests. So it was perfectly and they've built roads all over the place. So the grasslands are threatened by all sorts of things, but one of them is the influx of tourists who can use the roads. So we could drive there easily enough. And by pure chance, it turned out that Maria was the, her name, was in town, a place called Alugoro, um, Aluguya. And her daughter had an apartment there, and she happened to be there. And the museum director knew this, and so I was able to go and see her. Pure chance, lovely.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, what kind of made you choose to focus on, that community as opposed to, you know,
Well, I do a lot about the Mongols. I mean, that's part of the main story. And I knew there were other minority groups uh, up in Uraanbaya, and I could have gone elsewhere. I could have gone um, I could have gone further east, but I was interested in Uraanbaya because the Mongols had been there initially. Kasar, Genghis's brother, was there and quite a hero, and I wanted to explore that. So I was in Ewenki territory anyway, and it was one thing led to another.
yeah, that totally makes sense.
I mean, this is part of the selection process that I had to undergo. I couldn't cover everything, but this was a good way of looking at the spread of China into minority territories.
Absolutely. Yeah, and thinking about not being able to cover everything, was there any information or kind of topics or events that you really wanted to include, or wish you could have included or dove into more even, that you were unable to include in this book for some reason or other?
Oh. One of my postgraduate courses was the history of science, and I did 19th century biology. I became interested in dinosaurs. My first book was on dinosaurs, and there's a big dinosaur story in Mongolia to do with the New York Museum of Natural History, where Roy Chapman Andrews was the guy who organized expeditions from China up into Mongolia to find dinosaur skeletons, which anyone can see now in the New York Museum, and that's a terrific story. And I would love to have been able to include that, but I could not find an excuse to do it. It's not good, not quite enough on my subject, which is the relationship between China and Mongolia.
There
Yes.
haven't been any sort of claims to the That's they have not, yet worked in the dinosaurs, the fossils into their
They
sort of
no,
claim to Mongolia.
they're very proud of their fossils. Um, but they are actually the ones that are most important now are the fossil birds which have been found up in Manchuria. And David Attenborough's actually done a program about them and the evolution of birds from reptiles. Anyway, that's a whole other
Yeah.
subject and a bit off our theme.
True. Yeah, but so interesting. Um, yes, especially given kind of recent, in the last, 15 years or so, 20 years maybe, repatriation of, illegally trafficked, dinosaur remains, fossils out of
Yes.
Mongolia and then repatriating them back into Mongolia. So that's, yeah, such an interesting topic. But yes, perhaps a different book. So,
Yeah. Well, I went down to see the Flaming Cliffs, found by Chapman Andrews, and found them. Well, when I first went there, they were pretty wild, and there was nobody else around. Now it's a tourist site, and there are kiosks and
absolutely. Yeah.
a terrible restaurant, and anyway, it's very much on the tourist trail.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so interesting just thinking about. So, like I said, I went to Mongolia for the first time in 2018, and even between then and now, I go back, and every time I go, things are so different. And the first time I went to the Flaming Cliffs and to the Gobi was 2019, and I think
Oh.
there were some of those tourist kiosks, but that whole visitor center and the restaurant or cafe and,
Mhm.
and all of that, none of that was there, and now it's all that, and it's just so interesting even that short, it's been less than a decade, and there's been so much change. And, I imagine that, in the last, what, 30 plus years that you've been
Yeah.
going, it's just been, I've, spoken to other folks who have, started going in the late 80s or early 90s, and it's just, I see their pictures. I'm like, what do you mean? It's crazy. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, so, I want to be, respectful of your time here. But I was wondering, if you could just speak a little bit, what is kind of one thing that you hope that readers might take away from Conquering the North when they read it?
Well, I suppose it's to be aware of Chinese anti-minority sentiment, especially anti-Mongol sentiment, and the obsession with unity in China at the moment, which is it's conceivable that in decades, we're talking quite long term here, decades to come, the Mongolian fear of Chinese dominance will be will come to pass, and that China would perhaps be able to take over all Mongolia because on the grounds that it was once part of the Manchu Empire and that therefore, as far as they're concerned, it's still theoretically part of China. And I think there's a real danger that this might happen given the Chinese influx in terms of Oyu Tolgoi and the mining in Mongolia, the immense wealth which is underneath the ground, and the fact that China has so much money that they could really buy a good deal of it if they were allowed to, and to warn the Mongolians that really they should be aware of this and should be on their guard and preserve their independence, come what may.
Yeah, that's a powerful note, I think, to, sort of start to wrap up on, and one that certainly I've, heard from many folks is this just idea of how important it is to, preserve and kind of continue to support, Mongolian culture, Mongolian language, Mongolian independence, how important that is for people there. So, and for, I think, any of us who are invested in or interested in, the country and its history, so, and its present. Um, so, yeah, thank you. As we wrap up here, what's next for you? What do you have going on?
I'm interested in a Mongol queen called Sorgoktani. I
Okay.
don't know if you know about her.
Mhm.
Well, I'm researching, hoping to do a biography of her, uh, because she was terribly important and much underappreciated now.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, I would love to. Definitely am excited for that one as well. I totally agree. I think she's um, yeah, like you said, an underrepresented, underappreciated figure in all of these events that, so many of, the kind of events that we're living in the wake of. And the Yuan dynasty, for example. And so, I am excited to hear more about that. And, definitely, again, I really enjoyed reading Conquering the North. And I would say to anyone watching, please, if you're in Mongolia, check it out from our library, or, you can find it online in bookstores, or at your local library as well. So,
I've
yeah.
just asked, it's only in hardback at the moment, but I presume that there will be a paperback in a year or so. It's only just come out in the States in December. It's been out here in the UK since May.
Yes. So yes, right now, yeah, we have the hardback, as I will. Here it is. And yes, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's well written. It's readable, and I really enjoyed it. And really enjoyed, getting to speak with you today. So thank you so much for, taking this time to talk with me. I'm so, appreciative of the work that you've done, and your support of Mongolia and Mongolian culture. So thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.